Hello and welcome to Topic 5, Lecture 2. And in this lecture, we are going to look at the gender gap in Congress. So, what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, since we're going to be learning about the gender gap within Congress, I thought it might be helpful just to do a quick review of the United States Congress so we're all on the same page in terms of getting a refresher of the federal legislative branch. Then we'll go ahead and describe the gender gap in the U.S. Congress and how it has changed over time. And then we'll also give some possible reasons for why there is this gender gap. Now, there are two readings, or there are more than two readings for this week. But the readings I want to point your attention to are the two readings about one, possible ways of closing the gender gap in Congress, and then also, does it matter that there's a gender imbalance within Congress? In other words, would Congress function differently if there was gender parity? And so you're responsible for reading those articles, and then for our midterm exam, you will be applying what you learned from those articles to analyzing this gender disparity within Congress. So that's what we've got on the docket. Let's go ahead and get started. So as we discussed earlier in the semester, you know that the United States government is divided into three branches: the executive branch, which includes the presidency; the judicial branch, which includes obviously the Supreme Court of the United States; and then the legislative branch, which is composed of the United States Congress. And as it says there, that the United States Congress has two chambers. It's a bicameral legislature. It has the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. So let's look into each of these in a little bit more depth. So the United States House of Representatives. The United States House of Representatives is a much bigger body than the United States Senate. There are 435 members in the United States House of Representatives. It hasn't always been 435. That's not something that's in the Constitution, but Congress has the power to increase or decrease the size of the House of Representatives, and it's been at 435 members since about the middle of the 19th century. Members of the House serve a 2-year term, so it's a relatively short term, and there are no term limits. So what that means is you can run for re-election as many times as you want, and when you run for re-election, then you can get re-elected and you can serve for many, many years. Now, there are two chambers of the United States Congress, the House and the Senate. And those two chambers, that bicameral legislature, that is a product of compromise. When the Constitution was being crafted, some people at the Constitutional Convention wanted the federal legislature to be based solely on population, and the others said no, that each state should have an equal voice within this federal legislature. And so a compromise was made. The United States House of Representatives is based on, its representation is based on population. So the bigger your state is in terms of population, not geography, but the more people that live in your state, the more voice you get in Congress because you have more representatives, okay? And so each representative represents about the same number of people, about 720,000. States like California have over 30 members of the House, and some very, very small in terms of population, like Wyoming, only have one member of the House. Wisconsin has 8. The serving in the United States House of Representatives, it's a little less prestigious than serving in the Senate, and it's also more locally focused. Since you are, as a representative, you are serving your state, but also your particular district within that state, then you kind of focus on those interests of your district. So there are 8 House districts within the state of Wisconsin. That's based on our population. We're not a hugely populous state. And right now, 5 of those seats are held by Republicans, and 3 of those seats are held by Democrats. The House seats that are probably most relevant for y'all in terms of where you live is Wisconsin 1, which is sort of it used to be Paul Ryan's district, and so it's down in sort of the Janesville, but then also into the Racine and Kenosha area. And Brian Steele, a Republican, was elected in 2019 after Paul Ryan stepped down. Gwen Moore represents Wisconsin 4. That is the area that is primarily Milwaukee. And she's a Democrat, and she's been in office since 2005. And Wisconsin 5 is up in the Washington County area, and parts of Waukesha as well. And that is the representative there is Scott Fitzgerald, a Republican who was elected in 2021 after James Sensenbrenner stepped down after serving a long time in Congress. The members of the House are up for re-election every 2 years. And so the next election for the House is the presidential election on November 5th, 2024. So the United States Senate is a much smaller legislative body. That representation is based just on the number of states that we have in the union. Each state gets 2 senators for a total of 100 senators. And senators serve a much longer term. They serve a 6-year term. Again, no term limits. And so 100 senators, 2 from each state. Serving the United States Senate is oftentimes considered more prestigious, and it has more of a national focus just because of the nature of some of the topics that the Senate deals with, and also because you're representing your whole state, and so there's lots of like sort of this locality interest that you might have as a member of the House. Wisconsin obviously has 2 senators, Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson. What's interesting about Tammy Baldwin and Ron Johnson is Tammy Baldwin is probably one of the most progressive senators in the United States Senate, and Ron Johnson is probably one of the most conservative senators in the Senate. And so it's interesting that the state of Wisconsin, which is considered a purple state, elects Tammy Baldwin, very progressive, but also elects Ron Johnson, very conservative. And the dates there show you how long they've been serving in office. Senator Johnson won re-election in 2022, and Senator Baldwin is up for re-election in 2024, and she is running for re-election. Unlike the House, the Senate, only 1/3 of the Senate will be up for election in 2024. And so since they serve these 6-year terms, only 1/3 of the Senate stands for election every 2 years. And so since the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years, it's possible there is all new members of the House and new members of the Senate. And so that the congressional session is 2 years long. And so every 2 years, a new session of Congress begins. And each session of Congress is numbered, okay? And the session itself is 2 years long. Currently, it's 2023, we're in the 118th U.S. Congress, okay? And it runs from the new members of Congress or the returning members. Everybody gets sworn in on January 3rd, 2023. That's when it's always on January 3rd, but for us, the election was in 2022, and they got sworn in 2023. And then that session will end on January 3rd, 2025, as new members come into Congress. I just wanted to include that in the lecture as you're reading and they're talking about the 118th Congress. I wanted you to make sure that you understood what that meant. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the demographics of Congress. And when we use the word demographics, basically what that word means is that you are looking at sort of sociological features of a body, right? And so you would be saying, okay, what's the demographics of Congress? You'd say, okay, what's the gender breakdown? What's the race and ethnicity breakdown? What is the age breakdown? Income, right? Religion. All of that would, be included in what would be considered demographic information. So what is the demography or the demographics of Congress? Is Congress representative of the United States? and I mean, they're supposed to be our representatives, but does Congress like actually look like America? Is it like a microcosm, right? Well, the answer to that, as we'll see in more detail in a moment, is that Congress is not demographically representative. That when you look at the general population of the United States and you compare it to the population in Congress, it is not. It doesn't mirror itself. There are some gaps. However, the demographics of Congress is the gap is closing. So where there is a gap between the general population and the population that's in Congress, that gap is getting smaller and smaller. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So this is an infographic from I Teach American Government, and it's from my American Government textbook by Ginsburg et al. Called We the People. And what I think is really helpful about this graphic is that, well, for one, you have to understand the key. And so here's my magic pen. The outside of the rainbow is the biggest of the arc is U.S. population. And then the inside, the middle one is the House, because there are 435 members. And then you've got the Senate, the smallest, okay? And so what this is showing is it's showing us gender, party, race, religion, and then some other factors as well. And it's basically saying, okay, this is the gender breakdown in the United States, okay? It's color-coded pink and blue. Okay, I guess they didn't get the message. But pink is for the ladies and blue is for the guys, okay? And then it shows you how the Congress compares to the general population, okay? So from your readings this week, it doesn't come as a surprise to you that there are more women in the U.S. population than men, 51% to 49%. However, there are that only about 29% of Congress is women, and the rest is men, got 71%, okay? And so, obviously, this 29% of Congress being women, that's the highest it's ever been. But still, we got a pretty significant gap to close. This is interesting, although, this is party. And so, this is the percentage of people who identify as Republicans, 27% in the Gen Pop, 29% as Democrats, but 42% identifies independents. But as we know, two-party system broke down right down the middle. Race comes closer to being having less of a gap. There's less of a racial gap in Congress than there is a gender gap. But still, 70% of Congress is white, whereas only 16% of the U.S. population identifies as white. Okay. Religion is also interesting here as well. That obviously the Congress is predominantly Christian, and Protestant, and then Catholic. Okay, then Jewish, obviously Jewish, not Christian. Mormon is Christian, and all others. Okay, so you see that the vast majority of people in Congress are Christians. But check it out in the Gen Pop. It really. Almost a third, more than a third, or about a third, 32% of Americans, fall in the all other category of religions. And a lot of times that just means that they're nones, N-O-N-Es, right? That they don't have a religious affiliation. And so I know we're going to be focusing on gender in a moment, but it's just interesting to see, how some of this, the rest of this sort of plays out. And recently there's been a lot in the news about the average age of of the members of Congress. And so you got Senate 64, House 59, average age of the United States is 38. So got kind of an age gap there as well. So as I noted on the last slide, advances have been made in diversity, but still a way to go. 51% of the United States population is women, but only 29% members of Congress are women. When it comes to openly LGBTQ representatives, they make up about 2% of the House and 2% of the Senate, which is false. 5.6% of the general population identifies as LGBTQ. Wisconsin actually has two members of the LGBTQ community Wisconsin Representative Mark Pocan, who represents the Madison area, and Senator Baldwin are Mark Pocan's gay and Senator Baldwin is lesbian. And currently there are no open trans or non-binary members of Congress, and there's 1.6 in the general population. And so this just kind of shows you some of that gap. And then also in terms of race, 77% of Congress is white, while only 60% of the United States population is white. But as you'll see in our readings, both when it comes to gender and when it comes to racial diversity, great strides have been made. Okay, so here are some graphs from the Pew Research Center that give you a visualization of the increase of women representation in Congress. And so it starts, let me put my magic pen on here. It starts at the very, the first woman to serve in Congress was in 1917. It was Jeannette Rankin. She was elected in 1916, and she represented Montana. You might be thinking, hey, wait a second, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. Well, different states allow women to vote prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. And so not only was she able to vote, but she was able to serve in Congress as a representative from Montana. And so, there's some moderate increase. Keep in mind, this is the numbers, not the percentage. So we're at 128 right now. That's the highest it's ever been in terms of women in Congress. But it's still, only 29% of Congress is women. And so, you see sort of, moderate gains here. But I want you to know, and they talk about this in your textbook here, this is 1992. And 1992 is oftentimes known as the year of the women because, as you see this increase in the number of women who are serving in Congress. Some speculations as to why that increase took place. One is there was redistricting, so there were more new districts kind of, were refigured. And so it made it, some districts were competitive districts where there was no incumbent. And so it's easier to win a seat if there's no incumbent. And so some think it was due to that. But a lot of people think it was because of the backlash to the Clarence Thomas nomination confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court. As you're well aware, Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment when she worked with him at the Equal Opportunity Commission. And so there was a lot of attention that was placed on the issue of harassment and that he was confirmed anyways. And so some think that women were mobilized to get and participate in a run for office. And then we see a steady increase from there. I want to note also that we see this pretty big leap in 2018. And that has to do with pretty much a backlash to the Trump getting elected. And then here we are at 128 today. I do want you to note too the difference in terms of the party breakdown. And so as you learned in the first lecture, that women are more likely to identify as Democrats than Republicans, and that plays itself out in the there are more women representatives who are Democrats than Republicans, although we are seeing some increases there, particularly in the 128th. So this is the House, this is the Senate, okay? And so we see, similar sorts of trends within the Senate as well. In one of the articles you're reading for this week, it states that if the United States continues at its current rate of increasing women's representation in Congress, we won't see gender parity in Congress until 2008. And while some of you might still be alive by then, I doubt I will be. So I guess there are three questions we can kind of ask, and I'm going to ask and answer one of the questions, but it's going to be up to you guys to read the articles and to explore the answers to these other two questions. So in the time that we have remaining in this, we're going to take a look at what is the cause of this gender gap. Is there some reason why there's a gap in Congress? And then is the gender gap a cause for concern? would Congress govern differently if there were more women in Congress, if it was equally represented by 50% men and 50% women? And if the answer is yes, that the Congress would govern differently, then what are some steps to take to close this gap? Okay. So as I said, I'll focus on answering this question. And then in the articles y'all are going to read, you're going to focus on answering those questions. And so there are several potential reasons for why there is a gender gap in Congress. Some people think that there is a gender gap in Congress because we don't have term limits. And so people can, as long as they get reelected, they can stay in office for a very long time, 20, 30 years. And that, not that they don't stand for reelection, but it's hard to beat an incumbent, okay? So it's hard to bring in new people and to, have the demographics of Congress look more like the demographics of the United States when you have people serving in office for such a long period of time. There are other reasons that you'll be learning about in your readings. One is the way we fund our campaigns and the kind of ballots that we use. Not the ballots, but the we use winner take all as a method for determining the winner. There are other ways that might actually open up to Congress to being more demographically representative. But the one I want to focus on is not in one of the readings, but I can put the link to this article in. I'll put it within our Canvas site. But the reason I want to look at is the so-called ambition gap. Okay. And what the ambition gap is it's the ambition that a person has to run for office, okay? Like you ask somebody, hey, have you ever thought about running for office? And they say, absolutely not. I've never run for office. Or they'd say, oh, no, I've really thought about it. And so the Brookings Institute, they're a think tank, and since 2001, they've conducted a survey every 10 years. And so they did one in 2001, 2011, and they just did one in 2021. And the study is called the Citizens Political Ambition Study. And what this study looks at is that it basically is a survey of 4,000 potential candidates, okay? And so, sure, anybody can run for office, but there's certain characteristics that make a person like probably a better candidate. That they have a professional background, that's common with other people who run for office, such as business people, lawyers, educators, political activists, okay? So, every 10 years they get this sort of group of people that they consider potential candidates. And then they survey them. And the group is divided equally among men and women. And then they ask them questions about whether or not they consider running for office. And what's really interesting is that the study that's been going on for 20 years, that even though we've had this increase in the number of women serving not just in Congress, but in other elected offices. For heckadoodle, we have Kamala Harris, the first, vice president of the United States, who's a woman, right? That you would think with all these sorts of role models that women would be more likely to have that ambition to run for office. And that's not what the study found. What the study found that overall that women today in 2021 are just as unlikely as women were 20 years ago to express interest in running for office. In 2021, nearly 60% of men, and that's those professional potential candidate men in the survey, that 60% of men have considered running for office, whilst nearly 60% of women have not. So nothing's changed in those last 20 years. And one might be asking themselves, WTF, what is going on here? So, the results of this survey are really pretty interesting, that there has been no change. And in fact, they said that in the 2021 study that women were actually like a little less likely to want to run for office than they were in 2001. And so what is going on here? Why is there this big ambition gap between men and women? And it matters. If to run for office, you have to want to run for office. And if you don't want to run for office, then you're just not going to run for office. And so when women lack that ambition to run for office, it makes it more difficult to actually increase the number of women in elected offices. And so, according to the survey, when they asked men and women in this potential, the potential candidates, that those who were surveyed in this study, men were just a lot more likely to say that they personally had thought about running for office, right? And so men would be like, "Oh yeah, like I've thought about running for office." Women are like, "No, I haven't really thought about running for office." And so there was a big gap there. And that even though that these folks are equal in credentials in terms of education and having sort of backgrounds that would set them up real well for serving in office, men are more likely to view themselves as qualified to run, while women view themselves as less qualified. Okay, and so this study has found this, and other studies have found it as well, that women tend to dequalify themselves. They're like, "Oh, well, I don't really have the experience, or, I'm sure there's somebody else who could do a better job. I just don't feel qualified." But men are more likely to say, "Hell yeah, I feel qualified. I'm going to go for it." Okay. And also it's about the encouragement that people get to run for office. The study found that in this survey, men were 2/3 more likely to be encouraged to run for office than women were. Okay, and that's what they reported out. And so either being encouraged to run for office from an elected official or a party leader, or a friend or a colleague, like, "You should run." Men are more likely to get that message from others than are women. And so, I mean, it may be, hard to ever figure out what causes this ambition gap. There could be other things in it as well. It could be a sense of not wanting to go through the campaigning. The balancing of work and life would be difficult, and that might be a bigger concern for women than men. But regardless, that ambition gap is there. Okay, so we've got one piece of the puzzle in terms of maybe what is the cause of the gap, ambition gap, but there's other causes as well. But you'll be reading about whether or not the gender gap is a cause for concern, whether if there were more women in Congress, Congress would govern in a different way, and if in a different way, would it be a better way? And also, that you'll be reading about what steps to take to close the gap if so inclined. And as I mentioned before, you will be using that information to apply to a question for our midterm exam. All right, thanks a lot for paying attention, and I will talk to you again soon.